The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty training ground as Elena Vasquez adjusted her rifle for the third time. Her calloused fingers moved with practiced precision, checking the scope alignment one final time before the qualification test. At 23, she had already earned a reputation as one of the most skilled marksmen in her unit, but today felt different. Today carried the weight of everything she had worked toward. Elena's journey to this moment had been carved from determination and necessity. Growing up in a small border town where opportunities were as scarce as rain, she had learned to shoot when she was barely tall enough to hold her grandfather's old hunting rifle. Her father, a veteran himself, had recognized her natural talent early on. While other children played with dolls or video games, Elena spent her afternoons at the makeshift range behind their house, learning to breathe with the rhythm of her heartbeat, to find that perfect moment between breaths where the world stood still. The decision to enlist hadn't been easy. Her mother had cried for 3 days straight when Elena announced her plans. Her younger brother Miguel had begged her not to go, clinging to her uniform the night before she left for basic training. But Elena knew this was her path to something greater, not just for herself, but for her family who had sacrificed so much to support her dreams. Basic training had been brutal, but Elena thrived where others struggled. While her fellow recruits complained about the early morning runs and endless drills, she pushed herself harder. She understood that every push-up, every obstacle course, every sleepless night was building toward this moment. Her drill sergeants noticed her dedication, but more importantly, they noticed her exceptional marksmanship skills. The rifle range became Elena's sanctuary. While others saw targets and numbers, she saw art in motion. The way the bullet traveled through space, the mathematical precision required to account for wind, distance, and elevation. It all spoke to something deep within her. Her scores consistently ranked in the top percentile, earning her recognition and eventually selection for advanced sniper training. During those grueling months of specialized training, Elena formed bonds with her fellow soldiers that felt stronger than blood. There was Marcus, the quiet kid from Ohio who could disappear into any environment like a ghost. Sarah, the tough-talking woman from Texas who had a photographic memory for terrain maps. And then there was David, the medic who somehow always knew exactly what to say when the pressure became overwhelming. Together, they had endured exercises that tested not just their physical capabilities, but their mental resolve. Lying motionless in freezing rain for 18 hours straight, waiting for the perfect shot that might never come. Learning to control not just their breathing, but their very heartbeat, because even the slightest tremor could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Elena's superiors had taken notice of her exceptional abilities. Her commanding officer, Colonel Harrison, had personally recommended her for the most challenging assignments. She had completed 3 successful deployments, each one adding to her growing reputation as a soldier who could be counted on when everything was on the line. But success had come with a price. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Every mission meant life or death decisions, not just for herself, but for the soldiers who depended on her skills. She had saved countless lives with her precision shooting, eliminating threats before they could harm her fellow troops. Each successful shot was a victory, but it was also a reminder of the terrible power she wielded. The nightmares had started during her second deployment. Dreams where her hands shook uncontrollably, where she missed crucial shots, where her failures led to the deaths of people she cared about. She never spoke about these dreams to anyone, not even the military psychologists during their routine evaluations. She couldn't afford to be seen as anything less than completely stable and reliable. Her family back home knew nothing of the true nature of her work. In her letters, she wrote about the beautiful sunsets in foreign places, about the friendships she had formed, about how much she was learning. She never mentioned the missions that kept her awake for days at a time, or the weight of the decisions she had to make in split seconds. Her mother still worried constantly, but she was proud too. Elena was the first person in their family to serve with such distinction. Now, standing on this training ground, Elena felt the familiar calm that preceded any important moment. Her breathing was steady, her mind clear. The qualification test ahead of her was more than just another evaluation. It would determine her eligibility for a specialized unit that represented the pinnacle of military achievement. Everything she had worked for, All the sacrifices she and her family had made had led to this moment. She thought about her grandfather, who had passed away during her first deployment. He had been so proud when she enlisted, telling everyone in their small town about his granddaughter who was going to serve her country. He had taught her that shooting was about more than just hitting targets. It was about discipline, respect, and understanding the profound responsibility that came with such skills. The other candidates were arriving for the test, each carrying their own stories of determination and sacrifice. Elena recognized a few faces from previous trainings, soldiers whose reputations preceded them. The competition would be fierce, but she felt ready. Her rifle, a precision instrument that had become like an extension of her own body, felt perfectly balanced in her hands. As she took her position on the firing line, Elena allowed herself a moment to appreciate how far she had come. From that dusty backyard range where she had first learned to shoot tin cans, to this moment where she stood among the military's most elite marksmen. The journey had tested every aspect of her character, pushing her beyond what she had ever thought possible. The range officer began calling out preliminary instructions, his voice carrying across the field where Elena and her fellow soldiers waited. This test would evaluate not just their shooting accuracy, but their ability to perform under extreme pressure, their tactical decision-making skills, and their capacity to work as part of a coordinated team. Elena closed her eyes for just a moment, feeling the weight of her rifle in her hands, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the solid ground beneath her feet. When she opened them again, she was ready. Ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Ready to prove that all the preparation, all the sacrifice, all the sleepless nights, and difficult decisions had been worth it. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and Elena Vasquez prepared to demonstrate why she had earned her place among the military's finest. She had no way of knowing that this test, which she approached with such confidence and determination, would set in motion a series of events that would challenge everything she believed about duty, honor, and the true meaning of serving something greater than herself. The morning air was crisp and clean, filled with possibility and the promise of achievement. Elena checked her rifle one final time, adjusted her position slightly, and waited for the signal to begin. In her mind, she could hear her grandfather's voice, steady and encouraging, reminding her that she had already overcome every obstacle that had been placed in her path. This was her moment, and she was ready to seize it. The range officer's whistle pierced the morning air, and Elena settled into her shooting stance with the fluid motion of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. The qualification course stretched out before her like a deadly puzzle, with targets positioned at varying distances and elevations, some stationary, others moving in unpredictable patterns. Wind flags fluttered along the range, providing crucial information about the invisible forces that could affect her shots. Elena's first target appeared at 800 meters, a silhouette that would challenge even experienced marksmen. She adjusted her scope with micro-precise movements, accounting for the slight crosswind that had picked up since the morning calm. Her breathing fell into the familiar rhythm she had perfected over years of training. Inhale, exhale halfway, hold, and in that perfect moment of stillness between heartbeats, she squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out across the range, and even before the spotter confirmed the hit, Elena knew she had found her mark. Center mass, exactly where she had aimed. The satisfaction of a perfect shot never got old, but she couldn't allow herself to dwell on success. The course demanded constant adaptation and split-second decision-making. The targets came faster now, testing not just accuracy but speed and tactical awareness. A scenario unfolded where she had to engage multiple threats while accounting for simulated civilian positions. Elena's training kicked in automatically, her mind processing angles, distances, and priorities with mechanical efficiency. Each shot was deliberate, each decision calculated to minimize risk while eliminating threats. Colonel Harrison watched from the observation tower, his experienced eyes tracking Elena's performance with growing admiration. He had seen countless soldiers attempt this qualification, but few demonstrated the natural ability and composure that Elena displayed under pressure. Her scores were exceptional, placing her well above the threshold required for the specialized unit. As the course progressed, Elena found herself in an unusual state of flow. Everything seemed to slow down around her, allowing her to process information and react with unprecedented clarity. The rifle felt weightless in her hands, responding to her intentions before she was even fully conscious of forming them. This was what her grandfather had described years ago, the moment when technical skill transcended into something approaching artistry. The final stage of the qualification presented the greatest challenge yet. Elena had to navigate a complex scenario involving hostage rescue, where precise shooting was literally a matter of life and death for the simulated civilians. The margin for error was essentially zero, requiring shots that would test the absolute limits of her capabilities. She positioned herself carefully, studying the scenario through her scope. The targets were partially concealed, requiring her to wait for brief windows of opportunity when clean shots would be possible. Patience had always been one of her greatest strengths as a marksman. While others might rush and miss, Elena understood the value of waiting for the perfect moment. The first hostage scenario unfolded, and Elena engaged with surgical precision. Her shot eliminated the threat, while leaving the hostage completely unharmed, threading the bullet through a gap that measured less than 6 inches. The range went silent for a moment before erupting in appreciative murmurs from the observing officers. But Elena remained focused, knowing that the course wasn't finished. 2 more scenarios followed, each more challenging than the last. She navigated them with the same methodical precision, her confidence building with each successful engagement. When the final whistle sounded, signaling the end of the qualification, Elena knew she had performed at the peak of her abilities. Colonel Harrison descended from the observation tower with a broad smile on his weathered face. He had served for 32 years and had never seen a more impressive qualification performance. Elena's scores weren't just exceptional, they were record-setting. Several veteran marksmen who had been observing the test approached to offer their congratulations and respect. The celebration was brief, but meaningful. Elena's fellow soldiers gathered around her, their admiration genuine and well-deserved. Sarah clapped her on the shoulder with characteristic enthusiasm, while Marcus offered his quiet but sincere praise. David, ever the medic, joked about how her steady hands would make her a natural surgeon if she ever decided to change careers. Within hours, word of Elena's exceptional performance had reached the highest levels of command. The specialized unit she had been testing for was more than just an elite assignment. It was a gateway to operations that could significantly impact national security. Her scores had eliminated any doubt about her qualifications, and the official notification came faster than anyone had expected. Elena felt a surge of pride and accomplishment as she read the orders. Everything she had worked for, all the sacrifices and dedication, had led to this moment of validation. She immediately called her family to share the news. Hearing the joy and pride in her mother's voice, the excitement in Miguel's congratulations. Her father, typically reserved with emotions, simply said he was proud of her, but Elena could hear the depth of feeling behind those simple words. The next few weeks passed quickly as Elena prepared for her new assignment. There were additional briefings, security clearances to update, and specialized equipment to become familiar with. The anticipation was electric, and she threw herself into preparation with the same intensity that had characterized her entire military career. It was during one of these preparatory meetings that Elena first noticed something was wrong. Colonel Harrison seemed unusually tense, avoiding eye contact, and speaking in clipped, formal tones that were unlike his usual demeanor. When she asked if everything was all right, he deflected the question and quickly ended the meeting. The change in his behavior was subtle, but unmistakable to someone who had worked closely with him for months. The first concrete sign of trouble came in the form of an unexpected meeting with military intelligence officers. Elena was called to a secure conference room where 3 officials in civilian clothes waited with thick folders and serious expressions. They introduced themselves with titles that meant little to her, but clearly carried significant authority within the military hierarchy. The questions began innocuously enough. They wanted to review her recent activities, her communications with family and friends, her financial records, and her social media presence. Elena answered everything honestly, assuming this was standard procedure for her new security clearance level. But as the questioning continued, she began to sense an undercurrent of suspicion that made her increasingly uncomfortable. They asked about her political views, her opinions on recent military operations, her thoughts on government policies, both domestic and foreign. Elena provided straightforward answers, but She could see the officers taking extensive notes and exchanging meaningful glances. The atmosphere in the room grew more tense with each passing minute. Then came a question that changed everything. One of the officers, a stern woman with steel-gray hair, looked directly into Elena's eyes and asked about her communications with certain individuals whose names Elena didn't recognize. When Elena truthfully stated she had never heard of these people, the woman's expression hardened noticeably. The meeting ended abruptly, with Elena being told she would be contacted soon with further instructions. As she walked back to her quarters, she felt a growing sense of unease. Something was happening behind the scenes, something that involved her, but that she didn't understand. The pride and excitement she had felt about her new assignment began to give way to anxiety and confusion. That evening, Elena tried to reach Colonel Harrison to discuss her concerns, but his aide informed her that the colonel was unavailable and would be for the foreseeable future. The same response came when she tried again the next day, and the day after that. It became clear that she was being deliberately isolated from her chain of command. The isolation deepened when Elena discovered that her access to certain areas of the base had been revoked without explanation. Computer systems she had used routinely for months now rejected her credentials. Fellow soldiers who had previously been friendly began avoiding her, their discomfort obvious when she approached them for conversation. Elena's anxiety transformed into growing alarm when she was summoned to another meeting, this time with officials she had never seen before. The atmosphere was decidedly hostile, with accusations flying about her loyalty, her associations, and her fitness for duty. Documents were presented that seemed to suggest connections and activities that Elena knew she had never been involved in. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was being set up. Someone, for reasons she couldn't fathom, was systematically destroying her career and reputation. The evidence being presented against her was fabricated, but it was sophisticated and convincing enough to fool people who didn't know her personally. Elena's protests of innocence were met with skeptical stares and dismissive gestures. The officials seemed to have already made up their minds about her guilt, and they were simply going through the motions of an investigation. When she demanded to see the specific evidence against her, she was told that much of it was classified and couldn't be shared with her directly. The final blow came when Elena was informed that pending the outcome of the investigation, she would be stripped of her specialized equipment and reassigned to administrative duties. The rifle that had become like an extension of her own body, the precision instrument that had defined her military identity, was to be confiscated immediately. Elena felt as though the ground had dropped out from beneath her feet. Everything she had worked for, everything she had achieved, was being swept away by accusations she didn't understand and evidence she had never seen. The injustice of it burned in her chest like a physical pain, but she was powerless to stop the machinery that had been set in motion against her. As she handed over her rifle to the military police, Elena felt a part of herself dying. The weapon had been more than just a tool. It had been a symbol of her competence, her dedication, and her place in the military hierarchy. Without it, she felt naked and vulnerable, stripped of the identity she had spent years building. The administrative assignment was clearly designed to humiliate and demoralize her. After years of high-stakes operations and critical missions, she found herself filing paperwork and answering phones in a windowless office. Her colleagues treated her with a mixture of pity and suspicion, unsure what to make of her sudden fall from grace. Elena knew she was being watched constantly, her every movement monitored and recorded. The investigation continued in secret, with officials occasionally summoning her for additional questioning, but never revealing what new evidence they claimed to have found. The psychological pressure was intense and relentless, designed to break down her resistance and force a confession to crimes she hadn't committed. But Elena's spirit, forged in the crucible of military training and hardened by years of challenging service, refused to break. She maintained her innocence with unwavering determination, even as the walls seemed to close in around her. Somewhere in the labyrinth of military bureaucracy, someone was orchestrating her destruction, and she was determined to find out who and why, no matter what it cost her. The fluorescent lights in the administrative office hummed with an annoying persistence that had become a soundtrack to Elena's new reality. 3 weeks had passed since her rifle had been confiscated, 3 weeks of mind-numbing paperwork and suspicious glances from colleagues who once respected her. The monotony was deliberate, designed to break her spirit and make her grateful for any opportunity to escape the tedium, even if it meant confessing to crimes she hadn't committed. Elena refused to give them that satisfaction. Each morning, she arrived at precisely the appointed time, completed her assigned tasks with meticulous attention to detail, and maintained the same professional demeanor that had characterized her entire military career. If they expected her to crack under the pressure of boredom and isolation, they would be disappointed. During her lunch breaks, Elena had begun her own quiet investigation. She couldn't access the official files related to her case, but she could observe patterns and behaviors among the personnel involved in her prosecution. The three intelligence officers who had first questioned her met regularly in conference room C, always with the same manila folders, always with expressions of grim determination. One of these officers, the stern woman with steel-gray hair whom Elena had learned was named Agent Caldwell, seemed particularly invested in the case. Elena had noticed Caldwell working late into the evening, her office light visible from the parking lot where Elena sometimes sat her car, thinking and planning. There was something personal about Caldwell's involvement that went beyond professional duty. Elena's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. David, the medic from her original unit, had been transferred to the base medical facility just as Elena's troubles began. Unlike her other former colleagues, David hadn't been instructed to avoid her, perhaps because medical personnel were considered less of a security risk. During a chance encounter in the base commissary, he slipped her a note with such casual skill that Elena almost missed it. The note contained a single word, Starbucks, followed by a time. Elena recognized the reference to a coffee shop just outside the base where soldiers sometimes met their families. The timing suggested David wanted to meet her there during his off-duty hours, away from the surveillance that monitored her every move on base. Elena arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, choosing a corner table where she could observe the entrance while keeping her back to the wall. Old habits from tactical training died hard, and the paranoia that had crept in her daily life made such precautions feel necessary rather than excessive. David arrived precisely on time, ordering a large coffee before joining her at the small table. He spoke in low tones, his medical training having taught him the value of discretion when discussing sensitive matters. What he told Elena in the next 20 minutes changed everything she thought she knew about her situation. The investigation against Elena hadn't begun with her exceptional qualification scores, as she had assumed. It had started months earlier, during her previous deployment, when she had successfully completed a mission that had embarrassed certain elements within the military hierarchy. David had learned this from overhearing conversations between medical staff who treated the psychological casualties of that operation. The mission had involved eliminating a high-value target who possessed information about corruption within the military supply chain. Elena's precise shooting had prevented the target from being captured alive and interrogated, which had frustrated investigators who wanted to pursue the corruption angle. Some officials had suspected that Elena had been ordered to kill rather than capture, suggesting a cover-up at higher levels. David explained that Agent Caldwell had a personal connection to the corruption investigation. Her brother, a career military officer, had been killed in an attack that might have been prevented if the supply chain corruption had been exposed earlier. The faulty equipment that contributed to his death could be traced back to the same network that Elena's target had been involved with. Elena felt the pieces beginning to fall into place. Caldwell wasn't interested in justice or national security. She was pursuing a personal vendetta, using Elena as a scapegoat for her brother's death. The fabricated evidence, the isolation tactics, the systematic destruction of Elena's career, it was all part of Caldwell's twisted quest for revenge against anyone connected to the corruption network. But David had more information. He had also learned that Colonel Harrison hadn't abandoned Elena voluntarily. The colonel had been pressured to distance himself from her case, with threats to his own career and pension if he continued to support her. Harrison was reportedly furious about the situation, but felt powerless to intervene directly without risking everything he had worked for during his long military career. Elena absorbed this information with a mixture of relief and anger. Relief that she wasn't paranoid or imagining the conspiracy against her, and anger that personal vendettas were being pursued through the military justice system. She thanked David for taking the risk to meet with her, knowing that his career could be jeopardized if his involvement became known. Over the following days, Elena used her administrative access to carefully research Agent Caldwell's background. She couldn't access classified files, but public records and military databases revealed a pattern of behavior that supported David's information. Caldwell had requested assignment to cases involving supply chain corruption with unusual frequency, often taking personal leave to pursue leads that other investigators considered dead ends. Elena also discovered that the intelligence officers working with Caldwell were relatively junior in rank and experience, suggesting that more senior officials either weren't aware of the personal nature of Caldwell's investigation or had chosen not to intervene. This gave Elena hope that if she could present evidence of Caldwell's bias to the right people, the case against her might be reconsidered. The challenge was gathering concrete evidence without access to classified files or the ability to conduct official interviews. Elena would have to rely on her observational skills and the training that had made her such an effective soldier. She began documenting everything she observed about Caldwell's behavior, creating a timeline that showed the personal motivation behind the investigation. Elena's opportunity came when she overheard a conversation between Caldwell and one of her subordinates. They were discussing plans to interview Elena's former teammates, hoping to find inconsistencies in their accounts that could be used to strengthen the case against her. Elena realized that her friends were about to be dragged into Caldwell's vendetta, potentially damaging their careers in the process. That evening, Elena made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. She decided to break protocol and contact her former teammates directly, warning them about what was coming and asking for their help in exposing the truth about Caldwell's investigation. It was a risk that could result in additional charges being filed against her, but Elena couldn't stand by and watch innocent people become collateral damage in someone else's personal war. She started with Marcus, whose natural caution and attention to detail made him the most likely to have noticed irregularities in their previous missions. Elena reached out through an encrypted messaging app that they had used during deployment, hoping that Marcus would recognize the urgency of the situation and respond despite the risk to his own career. Marcus's response came within hours, confirming Elena's suspicions and providing additional information that she hadn't been aware of. He had been approached by investigators several times over the past month, with questions that seemed designed to elicit negative information about Elena's conduct and loyalty. Marcus had refused to provide such information, but he had noticed that the investigators seemed disappointed by his positive assessment of Elena's character and performance. Sarah was next, and her response was characteristically direct and forceful. She had also been contacted by investigators and had become suspicious of their motives when they pressed her to speculate about Elena's psychological state and potential for disloyalty. Sarah had served with Elena for over 2 years and knew better than anyone that such speculation was baseless and malicious. Elena's investigation was gaining momentum, but she knew she needed more than anecdotal evidence to challenge Caldwell's case. She needed documentation, records that would prove the personal nature of Caldwell's investigation and the fabrication of evidence against her. Getting such documentation would require taking risks that could result in criminal charges rather than just administrative punishment. Elena spent several sleepless nights weighing her options. She could continue to endure the investigation passively, hoping that the lack of real evidence would eventually lead to her exoneration. But she had learned enough about Caldwell's determination and resources to know that passive resistance might not be enough. Caldwell was prepared to destroy Elena's career completely, and she had the institutional support to do it. Alternatively, Elena could take active steps to expose Caldwell's misconduct, even if it meant violating regulations and risking court-martial. The decision came down to whether she was willing to bet everything on her ability to prove her innocence and Caldwell's corruption. It was the kind of calculated risk that had defined Elena's military career, but the stakes had never been higher. Elena made her choice on a Thursday evening as she watched Caldwell's office light burning late into the night. She would gather the evidence she needed to expose the truth, whatever the personal cost. Her grandfather had taught her that some fights were worth the risk because the alternative was accepting injustice. This was one of those fights. The plan Elena formulated was simple but dangerous. She would use her administrative access to gather information about Caldwell's case files, focusing on discrepancies and evidence of fabrication. She would document meetings and communications that showed the personal nature of Caldwell's investigation. And she would prepare a comprehensive report that could be presented to higher authorities who might be unaware of what was happening at the operational level. Elena knew she would only get one chance to make her case. If she was caught gathering evidence illegally, Caldwell would have legitimate grounds to pursue criminal charges that could result in imprisonment as well as career destruction. But if she succeeded in exposing Caldwell's misconduct, she might not only save her own career, but prevent future injustices against other soldiers who found themselves caught in the crossfire of personal vendettas. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Elena sat at her administrative workstation, planning the most important mission of her military career. Unlike previous missions where she had been armed with precision weapons and supported by a trained team, this time she was fighting alone, armed only with determination and the skills that had made her one of the military's most trusted soldiers. Elena typed quietly at her keyboard, her fingers moving with the same steady precision that had characterized her shooting. Each keystroke was deliberate and purposeful, building toward a confrontation that would determine not just her own future, but the integrity of the system she had sworn to serve. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she accessed the network directories that had been open to her since her administrative assignment began. It was 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the base was quiet except for the skeleton crew of security personnel making their rounds. She had chosen this time carefully, knowing that most personnel would be off-duty and the risk of interruption would be minimal. The first file she accessed contained routine correspondence between Caldwell and her superiors, but buried within the bureaucratic language, Elena found references to personal interest and expedited processing that suggested the investigation was receiving unusual priority. More damning were email exchanges where Caldwell referenced her brother's death and expressed determination to make someone pay for the corruption that had cost him his life. Elena screenshot each document carefully, using a personal USB drive to store the evidence. She knew that accessing these files was a violation of protocol that could be used against her, but the content was too important to ignore. Caldwell had been using military resources to pursue personal revenge, and Elena was determined to document every instance of misconduct. As she dug deeper into the files, Elena discovered communication logs that showed Caldwell had been in contact with individuals outside the normal chain of command. Phone records indicated lengthy conversations with former colleagues who had worked on supply chain investigations, suggesting that Caldwell was coordinating with others who shared her desire for revenge against anyone connected to the corruption network. The most shocking discovery came when Elena accessed travel records that showed Caldwell had taken personal leave to visit locations connected to the corruption investigation. She had spent her own money and vacation time pursuing leads that had no official authorization, blurring the line between professional duty and personal obsession. This behavior alone was grounds for removing her from the case and potentially ending her career. Elena was so absorbed in documenting Caldwell's misconduct that she almost missed the soft footsteps approaching her workstation. Instinct honed by years of military training caused her to minimize her screen just seconds before Agent Caldwell herself appeared in the doorway of the administrative office. The two women stared at each other across the dimly lit office, the tension so thick it seemed to vibrate in the air between them. Caldwell's steel-gray hair was disheveled, and her usually crisp professional attire was wrinkled, suggesting she had been working late into the evening. Her eyes held a mixture of suspicion and exhaustion that made her appear older than her 50-something years. Caldwell moved into the office with the deliberate pace of someone trying to appear casual while actually being hypervigilant. She made a show of reviewing some paperwork at a nearby desk, but Elena could see her peripheral attention was focused on the computer screen that Elena had been using. The next few minutes would determine whether Elena's investigation ended in exposure and arrest or continued toward the truth. Elena forced her breathing to remain steady and her expression neutral as she continued typing routine administrative notes. She had learned the art of appearing busy while actually being alert during countless military operations, and those skills serve her well now. Caldwell seemed to be waiting for Elena to make a mistake that would justify searching her computer or questioning her presence in the office after hours. The standoff continued for nearly 10 minutes, with both women pretending to focus on legitimate work while actually engaged in a psychological battle of wills. Elena could feel sweat forming on her palms despite the air conditioning that kept the office uncomfortably cool. Every second that passed increased the risk that Caldwell would discover what Elena had been doing. Finally, Caldwell spoke, her voice carrying the artificial friendliness that poorly concealed hostility. She asked Elena what she was working on so late in the evening, noting that dedication to administrative duties was admirable but unnecessary. Elena responded with equal false politeness, explaining that she was catching up on filing that had accumulated during the day. Caldwell moved closer to Elena's workstation, ostensibly to review some documents in a nearby filing cabinet, but actually positioning herself where she could observe Elena's computer screen. Elena continued typing meaningless administrative notes, her fingers steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. She could smell Caldwell's perfume, an oddly floral scent that contrasted sharply with the woman's harsh demeanor. The conversation that followed was a masterpiece of subtext and hidden meanings. Caldwell spoke about the importance of following proper procedures and respecting chain of command, while Elena responded with references to integrity and the pursuit of truth. Both women understood they were discussing Elena's investigation, but neither was willing to address it directly while the legal situation remained ambiguous. Elena spent the next several days analyzing the information she had gathered and planning her next move. She had documented clear evidence of Caldwell's misconduct, but she needed to present it to someone with the authority and willingness to take action. The challenge was identifying officials who weren't already influenced by Caldwell's narrative or intimidated by her connections within the intelligence community. Colonel Harrison remained the most obvious choice, despite his forced distance from Elena's case. His reputation for integrity was well established, and his long military career suggested he would prioritize institutional values over personal convenience. Elena decided to risk making contact with him, even though doing so might provide Caldwell with additional ammunition for the case against her. Elena arranged to encounter Harrison at the base gym during his regular morning workout routine. The gym was public enough to make their conversation appear accidental, but private enough to allow for sensitive discussion. Elena timed her arrival to coincide with Harrison's cool-down period, when he would be less focused on exercise and more receptive to conversation. Harrison's initial reaction to seeing Elena was carefully controlled, but she could see the conflict in his expression. He was genuinely concerned about her situation, but constrained by orders that prevented him from providing direct assistance. Elena kept the conversation brief and superficial, but managed to pass him a note requesting a private meeting at a location away from base surveillance. The meeting took place 2 days later at a Veterans Memorial Park 20 miles from the base. Harrison arrived in civilian clothes, his usual military bearing softened but still evident in his posture and mannerisms. He explained that he was taking a significant risk by meeting with Elena, but his conscience wouldn't allow him to ignore what he suspected was a gross miscarriage of justice. Elena presented her evidence systematically, walking Harrison through the documentation she had gathered about Caldwell's personal motivations and misconduct. Harrison reviewed each document carefully, his expression growing increasingly grim as the scope of Caldwell's inappropriate behavior became clear. He had suspected that Elena was being railroaded, but the evidence exceeded even his pessimistic expectations. Harrison explained that presenting this evidence through normal channels would be difficult because Caldwell had cultivated relationships with senior officials who trusted her professional reputation. Any challenge to her case would need to be accompanied by irrefutable proof of misconduct, and it would need to be presented by someone with enough rank and credibility to demand serious consideration. The solution Harrison proposed was risky but potentially effective. He would arrange for Elena to present her evidence to General Morrison, the base commander, during a routine briefing session where other senior officers would be present. Morrison was known for his intolerance of corruption and his willingness to make difficult decisions when presented with clear evidence of wrongdoing. Elena agreed to Harrison's plan, understanding that this would be her only opportunity to present her case to decision-makers who could actually resolve the situation. If the presentation was unsuccessful, she would face not only the original charges but additional accusations related to her unauthorized investigation of Caldwell. Harrison spent the next week preparing for the briefing, carefully reviewing Elena's evidence, and developing a presentation strategy that would maximize impact while minimizing the appearance of personal bias. He was risking his own career by taking such direct action, but his military oath required him to defend justice even when it was personally inconvenient. The briefing was scheduled for a Thursday morning during General Morrison's weekly intelligence update. Elena would be present as a subject matter expert on administrative procedures, providing cover for her attendance without alerting Caldwell to the true purpose of the meeting. Harrison would present the evidence as part of a broader discussion about maintaining integrity in military investigations. Elena spent the night before the briefing reviewing her evidence one final time, memorizing key details that might be important during questioning. She understood that this presentation would determine not just her personal future, but potentially the careers of everyone involved in the conspiracy against her. The stakes couldn't be higher, and she was determined to present the truth with the same precision and professionalism that had characterized her entire military career. As she prepared for what might be the most important day of her life, Elena thought about her grandfather's lessons about standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. He had taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what was necessary despite fear. Tomorrow, she would need every ounce of courage she possessed. The fluorescent lights in her quarters hummed their familiar tune as Elena laid out her dress uniform for the briefing. Each ribbon and medal represented moments when she had served with honor and distinction, and she was determined to add another chapter to that legacy of service. Whatever happened in the morning, she would face it with dignity and the quiet confidence that came from knowing she had fought for the truth. Elena's hands were steady as she polished her shoes and prepared for battle, not with rifle and scope, but with evidence and integrity. The enemy this time wasn't a foreign threat, but corruption within the system she had sworn to protect. It was a different kind of warfare, but one where the same principles applied: precision, patience, and the absolute determination to complete the mission regardless of personal cost. The morning of the briefing dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the windows of Elena's quarters like crystalline evidence of the night's passage. She had slept fitfully, her dreams filled with images of courtrooms and confrontations, but she woke with the same sense of calm determination that had characterized her most successful military operations. Today would require the same mental discipline and emotional control that had made her an exceptional marksman. Elena dressed with meticulous care, each element of her uniform positioned with military precision. The ribbons and decorations that adorned her chest represented years of dedicated service and personal sacrifice, and she drew strength from their physical presence against her heart. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she would face it as a soldier who had earned her place through merit and integrity. The briefing room was located in the secure section of the base headquarters building, a sterile environment designed for sensitive discussions and critical decision-making. Elena arrived 30 minutes early, using the time to review her notes and mentally rehearse the key points she needed to communicate. The evidence she had gathered was compelling, but presentation would be crucial to its acceptance by officers who had been influenced by Caldwell's narrative. General Morrison entered the briefing room at precisely 0800 hours, followed by his senior staff and several intelligence officials, including Agent Caldwell. Elena felt her pulse quicken slightly when she saw Caldwell's expression of confident satisfaction, suggesting the woman believed this would be another opportunity to strengthen the case against Elena rather than defend against accusations of misconduct. Morrison was an imposing figure whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his intolerance for waste and corruption. He had commanded troops in 3 different combat theaters and had built a career on making difficult decisions based on facts rather than politics. Elena knew that if anyone would listen to evidence objectively, it would be Morrison, but she also knew he wouldn't tolerate false accusations or personal vendettas disguised as professional investigations. The briefing began with routine intelligence updates and administrative reports, the kind of mundane information that formed the backbone of military decision-making. Elena sat quietly through these presentations, observing the dynamics between the officers present and noting Caldwell's occasional glances in her direction. The woman seemed supremely confident that the morning would proceed according to her plans. Colonel Harrison took the podium when his turn came, beginning with standard reports about personnel issues and training schedules. Elena watched his face carefully, seeing no sign of nervousness despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. Harrison had been making difficult presentations to senior officers for over 20 years, and his experience showed in his calm, professional demeanor. The transition to Elena's case was so smooth that several officers didn't immediately realize what was happening. Harrison began discussing the importance of maintaining integrity in military investigations, using general examples that gradually became more specific. He spoke about the dangers of allowing personal motivations to influence professional decisions, and the need for oversight when investigators had potential conflicts of interest. Caldwell's expression began to change as Harrison's presentation continued, shifting from confident satisfaction to growing concern. She interrupted twice to ask clarifying questions, but Morrison gestured for her to remain silent until the presentation was complete. Elena could see understanding dawning in the general's eyes as Harrison methodically laid out the evidence of misconduct. The documents Elena had gathered were presented systematically, each one building on the previous evidence to create an undeniable pattern of inappropriate behavior. Harrison displayed Caldwell's personal emails referencing her brother's death and her desire for revenge. He showed travel records proving she had pursued unauthorized investigations using personal resources. Most damaging were communication logs that revealed coordination with individuals outside the normal chain of command. The room fell silent as the full scope of Caldwell's misconduct became clear. Elena watched the faces of the senior officers, seeing shock, anger, and disappointment as they realized how thoroughly they had been manipulated. General Morrison's expression was particularly severe, his jaw set in the hard line that Elena had heard described by officers who had faced his displeasure. Caldwell attempted to defend her actions, arguing that her investigation had uncovered legitimate security concerns that justified extraordinary measures. But her explanations rang hollow in the face of the documentary evidence that Harrison had presented. Her personal motivations were too clear, her procedural violations too numerous, and her deception too systematic to be explained as zealous but appropriate investigation. The questioning that followed was intense, but professional, with each senior officer seeking to understand how such misconduct had gone undetected for so long. Elena was called upon to provide testimony about her treatment during the investigation, and she responded with factual precision that impressed even her critics. She made no attempt to dramatize her situation or appeal for sympathy, instead presenting the facts with the same objectivity she had once applied to target assessment. Morrison's questions were particularly pointed, focusing on the fabricated evidence that had been used to support the case against Elena. Caldwell's attempts to justify these materials became increasingly desperate as she struggled to explain discrepancies that Elena's investigation had uncovered. The general's experience with intelligence analysis made him particularly effective at identifying inconsistencies and logical flaws in Caldwell's explanations. The turning point came when Morrison asked Caldwell directly whether she believed her brother's death had influenced her handling of Elena's case. Caldwell's response was defiant, but self-incriminating, as she insisted that personal motivation didn't invalidate professional conclusions. Morrison's immediate reaction made it clear that he viewed such thinking as fundamentally incompatible with military service. Elena felt a surge of vindication as the full scope of Caldwell's misconduct was exposed to officials who had the authority to take corrective action. But she also felt sadness for the damage that had been done to institutional trust and the careers that had been unnecessarily jeopardized by one person's inability to separate personal grief from professional responsibility. Morrison called for a brief recess, during which Elena observed animated conversations between the senior officers. Caldwell sat alone, isolated by the revelation of her misconduct and apparently stunned by how quickly her carefully constructed case had collapsed. Elena felt no satisfaction from the woman's obvious distress, understanding that Caldwell's actions had been motivated by genuine grief, even though they were professionally inappropriate. When the briefing resumed, Morrison's announcement was swift and decisive. The investigation against Elena would be immediately suspended pending a complete review of all evidence and procedures. Caldwell would be relieved of her duties and subjected to investigation for misconduct and abuse of authority. Elena's security clearance and specialized equipment would be restored pending completion of the review process. The relief Elena felt was overwhelming, but she maintained her military composure as Morrison continued his announcements. Colonel Harrison would be appointed to oversee the review process, ensuring that it was conducted with the integrity that had been lacking in Caldwell's investigation. Additional safeguards would be implemented to prevent future cases where personal motivations could compromise professional investigations. Caldwell was escorted from the briefing room by military police, her career effectively over, and her future uncertain, pending the results of multiple investigations into her conduct. Elena watched her leave with mixed emotions, understanding that Caldwell's downfall was necessary for justice, but also recognizing the human tragedy of someone whose grief had led her to destroy her own career and nearly destroy Elena's. The weeks that followed were a blur of depositions, interviews, and reviews as the military justice system worked to undo the damage caused by Caldwell's misconduct. Elena was exonerated completely, with official recognition that she had been the victim of an inappropriate investigation motivated by personal rather than professional concerns. Her record was cleared of all adverse information, and she received written apologies from officials who had been deceived by Caldwell's manipulation. More importantly to Elena, she was offered her choice of assignments within the specialized units she had originally qualified for. The exceptional scores from her qualification test were reinstated, and she was given priority placement in recognition of the injustice she had suffered. Elena chose an assignment that would allow her to serve with some of her original teammates, valuing the relationships that had sustained her through the darkest period of her career. Elena's rifle was returned to her in a ceremony attended by senior officers who wanted to demonstrate their support for the integrity of the military justice system. As she held the familiar weight of the precision instrument in her hands, Elena felt the completion that had been missing during her months of administrative exile. The rifle was more than just a tool. It was a symbol of her competence, her dedication, and her rightful place among the military's elite. The first time Elena returned to the firing range after her exoneration was emotional in ways she hadn't expected. The familiar routine of checking her equipment, adjusting her stance, and finding that perfect moment of stillness between heartbeats brought back all the confidence and skill that months of bureaucratic warfare hadn't been able to diminish. Her first shot was center mass, exactly where she had aimed, proving that some abilities transcended temporary circumstances. Elena's teammates welcomed her return with genuine enthusiasm, their respect for her enhanced rather than diminished by her ordeal. They had watched her maintain her integrity under extreme pressure, refusing to compromise her principles even when it would have been easier to accept a lesser punishment and move on with her career. That kind of character was rare in any profession, but it was especially valued in military service where trust and reliability could be matters of life and death. The new assignment brought Elena to situations where her skills were tested and her judgment was trusted in ways that reminded her why she had chosen military service in the first place. Each successful mission helped restore her confidence and rebuild her sense of purpose, while also demonstrating to her superiors that their decision to retain her had been correct. Elena also became involved in efforts to reform the military justice system to prevent future cases similar to what she had experienced. Her testimony before review boards was instrumental in implementing new oversight procedures and conflict of interest safeguards that would protect other soldiers from similar misconduct by investigators with personal motivations. The personal cost of Elena's ordeal was significant, but not insurmountable. Her relationship with her family had been strained by the uncertainty and stress of the investigation, but it was strengthened by her vindication and return to respected service. Her mother's pride in Elena's integrity was evident in every conversation, while her brother Miguel expressed admiration for Elena's courage in fighting for the truth, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Colonel Harrison received recognition for his role in exposing Caldwell's misconduct, but he privately told Elena that her courage in gathering evidence and presenting it despite enormous personal risk had been the decisive factor in achieving justice. He noted that many soldiers in her position would have accepted unfair punishment rather than fight a system that seemed determined to destroy them. Elena's story became known within military circles as an example of how individual integrity could triumph over institutional failure when supported by evidence and presented to officers committed to justice. Training programs began using her case as an example of how to identify and report misconduct while maintaining professional standards and personal dignity. Years later, when Elena had advanced to senior leadership positions, she would often reflect on the lessons learned during her darkest professional period. The experience had taught her that institutional systems were only as strong as the individuals who implemented them, and that personal integrity was the most important qualification for any position of trust or authority. Elena's grandfather would have been proud of how she had handled the crisis, standing up for principles that were more important than personal convenience or career advancement. She had proven that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with rifles and precision shooting, but with evidence and integrity, and that victory in such battles was often more meaningful than any traditional military achievement. The morning sun cast long shadows across the firing range as Elena prepared for another qualification test, this one marking her promotion to instructor status. Her movements had the fluid precision of someone who had faced every challenge the military could present and had emerged stronger and more capable. The young soldier she would soon be training would benefit not only from her exceptional marksmanship skills, but from her understanding that true strength came from maintaining integrity even when facing seemingly impossible odds. Elena adjusted her rifle for the final time, finding perfect balance in the instrument that had become an extension of her will and her values. As she prepared to take her shot, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, grateful for the trials that had tested and ultimately confirmed her character. Her finger moved to the trigger with practiced certainty, ready to demonstrate once again that precision, patience, and integrity were the foundations upon which all other achievements were built.